Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's National Quilter Circle Q&A. My name is Leah, and I am your moderator today. Before we get into your questions, I want to draw your attention to two things. One is, of course, the chat box. That's what you'll be using to send your questions in throughout the time that we have today. For most of you on the website, that's going to be right below your video player, but you can also use the chat in Facebook or YouTube if that's where you're catching this Q&A session. So you can go ahead and try it out. Let us know where you're watching from, maybe a quilting project that you're working on. Even if you don't have a question per se, just give us a little something about you so we know who's watching and what you're up to this month in quilting. Now, the second thing I have to draw your attention to is the Sapphire Shimmer pattern. That's a free download available to you, and that you can get by clicking the link in the description. And I also recommend keeping your eye on the chat box as well. Our team usually drops a link in there for this free pattern as well. Now, I get to introduce the person who will be answering all of your questions, and she is Colleen Tauke. You can see her over there with, I believe, the Sapphire Shimmer pattern quilt in her hands. So I'm going to send it over to her. Colleen, thank you for joining us today. As usual, start us off by telling us a little bit about what you've been up to. Maybe talk about that Sapphire Shimmer pattern a bit, and then we'll get into questions when you're ready.
Okay, thanks, Leah. It's always fun to help quilters out, to answer questions, to get them motivated, to find the right tool for the job, or provide a pattern for free. So Sapphire Shimmer is one that I made a while back, and it is all in blues. It was my dad's favorite color. So I had done one. Maybe some of you might remember hearing the name Emerald Eyes. It was a St. Patrick's Day project with all greens. And so I thought, well, what would it look like in blue? So I played around with some blue fabrics and came up with this design. And it's all about kind of speed piecing. I'm all about learning to do things the quickest way. I only have so much time to sew in my studio, and I want to make them best use of it. So learning to make triangle squares 8 at a time or the 2 at a time method helps you to put together all of these pieces quickly in an afternoon. So without having to cut any triangles. No one likes to have those raw bias edges anywhere near their needle. You can make this with all just squares and a marking process and pressing that you'll get these perfect half square triangles in order to arrange them in this design. So I have been working on all kinds of small projects. I have been working on, haven't revealed it yet, a project that is for my daughter's bridal shower, which is coming up here in just a few weeks. So I need to get it quilted, but I never know when she might be watching. So I've been kind of keeping it under wraps and was playing with colors. Maybe not my design. I did use a block that's been floating around out there that a lot of people have been using. But what I was really focused on was using a color palette that is a little outside of my comfort zone. I'm not really a rust and oranges kind of person. And so I kind of pushed myself because her wedding colors are in the rust category. So I was pushing myself to find lights and darks and mediums and some texture fabrics and figure out a way to combine those and create a really modern, contemporary looking quilt. So the focus for that quilt for me was to work on colors that maybe aren't my comfort zone because I really like blues, blues and reds and things like that. So it's kind of a practice and trying to do something that you wouldn't normally go to. So that's the one project I've been working on. This morning, I was working on what comes next on Facebook Live. And the next project we're going to do is this really fun Amish folded star. The pattern is not available yet, so don't anyone ask for it. It's not even all the way written yet. I'm still in the process of photographing it. So in a couple of weeks, you'll be seeing information about a folded star trivet. It doesn't even have an official name yet. That's how close to the cutting edge you all are coming in to watch us live on our Facebook events. So lots and lots of projects.
Always fun to have something to look forward to as well. And like you said, everyone viewing today is getting a sneak peek before it's even officially titled. So welcome,
Mhm.
welcome, welcome. We have a few hellos I'd like to get in before we get to our first question. People are viewing from all over, which is what we love to see. We have Linda that says aloha from Hawaii.
Oh, wonderful.
And then also out west on the states, we've got Dawn. She says hi from Washington State. And then from the Midwest, a little bit north of you, Deneen from Illinois. So we've got quite a few people here. Retha just jumped in from Fairfield, Texas. So welcome to everybody that's just joining us. Colleen Tauke is here to answer all of your quilting questions. With as much time as we have, we get to all the questions that we can get to. Don't worry if you miss today. You can come back next month. We'll do this all over again. So we're going to get to our first question, though, right off the bat from Faye. So Faye is wanting to know, Colleen, can you change a larger sized quilt, change that pattern to make it a throw size? And how would you do that?
Yes. If there's a will, there's a way in the quilt world. When you look at a large quilt and you want to size it down, there are a couple of different ways to approach it. You can pick out a section of the quilt that you like and just reproduce that. Maybe it is a medallion style and it has blocks in the center and then it goes around that. You could just take out a section of it to make it the size you want. Or you can actually do the resizing. That's the part that takes a little bit of math. You have to be thinking about the dimensions within the quilt. Sometimes when people look at a quilt and say, well, it's this size, I want to make it twice the size or even half the size, they start reducing all of the cutting by half. But you can't do that because the seam allowances are included in that. So when you take down something by half, you're also cutting the seam allowances in half, which is a no-no. We need our 1/4 inch seam allowances. So if you decide that you want to, instead of just taking a portion of a quilt and making kind of your iteration of it, maybe a corner or a center of the quilt, if you want to actually resize the entire quilt, you're going to need to look at the finished size of each of the components or blocks within that quilt. Now, in something like this, the components are all half square triangles. So knowing that they finish 3 inches, they are 3.5 with seam allowances. When we refer to something finished, we mean finished when the seam allowances are taken out, the part that just appears in the quilt itself, the part you see. And that each of these then is 3 inches. You could reduce that to half if you want. That would make it a 1.5 inch, but you're going to have to do the math to figure out anytime you're going to put a diagonal seam in there, it's going to take a little bit more math to figure that out. So if you're wanting to resize a larger quilt, it really comes down to how strong are your math skills and how determined are you to actually change the size of it, because within that, everything is going to shrink. And if you're working on, how do I explain it? A block that is a 9 patch. So it's 3 blocks across and 3 blocks on, kind of that grid that kind of floats within the block. If you think about breaking it up into sections, those usually will be, there is a math to them. So they have 2 inch, 2 inch, 2 inch, so that there's pieces across there. So your block will finish 2, 4, 6 inches by 6 inches. If it's on the odd number, so that each block within it is 3 inch, 3 inch, 3 inch, then that finishes to 9. If they're 4, it would be 12. You'll start to see that there's kind of a method to the numbering. Trying to take something maybe that is a 6 inch block and resize it to 7 will get you into the weeds on the math, because we're getting into numbers that are harder to split in half. And we have to remember to always add our seam allowances back on. And most of us, our rulers, the things that we use to cut with, usually only take us down to, well, the nice numbers that we like are 1/4 inches, 1/4, half, 3/4. Once in a while, we'll wander into the 1/8, 3/8, 5/8, 7/8. But we don't want to get into anything lower than that, because there's such a small amount, and our rulers get a little hazy. They don't really go much down beyond an eighth. So trying to keep with numbers that are already divisible by the same number. So if the component in here is a 3, you could take it down to 1.5. That's half of it. But trying to take this to 2-inch, it's going to get a little harder. So if you really have your heart set on it, sit down and take just one block out of the quilt, something that you know you can wrap your head around, and actually draw it out. It's kind of hearkening back to what my geometry teacher and my algebra 2 teacher in high school used to always teach us. Write down what you know. So draw it out on paper. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be to scale, but draw it out and write down, okay, these units now finish are 3 inches. What if I change that? What number do I need to change it to? Some things are easy to change. Others are a little more difficult. So I'm sorry to say that my answer is kind of the middle of the road. Like I said, if you are heart set on changing it, there's a will, there's a way. Just make sure that you kind of keep in mind that you need math that you can actually cut with a rotary cutter. Now, there are computer programs out there, like I usually use Electric Quilt 8. I've had past versions of that too. It's a program that you can go in and draw in so that you can come up with the math that would go into those blocks and resizing them. But again, you're still going to want to double check to see what it's telling you. Then later you're going to have to cut in order to size those down, because like I said, our rulers really, and most of us don't want to get anything lower than an 1/8. 16ths will give us a headache. So look at one block within the quilt, see if you can resize that. And once you get your grasp around that, work on the next. It may be a little bit of a long-term project.
All right. Well, hopefully that is a helpful starting point for anybody there that's looking to take a quilt pattern and shrink it down. Hopefully.
And there is a video out there that Ashley has done. Possibly our moderator can find. There's a video on resizing blocks that Ashley did recently. So possibly that could help you out too. Give you some extra visuals.
Hopefully rekindling a little love of math along the way. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to keep up with all of these hellos, but I'm going to do another round of them because we've got a lot of them. So we're going to continue with those. We've got viewers coming in from all over. Martha from Texas, Patty from Oklahoma City, Carol from Southern Alabama. We've got Sharon in Michigan, Kim in Tennessee, Lorena in Montana, Mary in California, Julia in Maryland, Susan in Kentucky, Pamela's in Connecticut. We've got Linda coming in all the way from Ontario, Lisa from Wisconsin, Cynthia from Minnesota. They're kind of neighbors here. Linda's also from Minnesota. And then we've got Patty in Washington and Nettie in Louisiana. So hello to everybody. As always, drop in where you're viewing from. You may find that there's a quilter out there watching that isn't too far from you. So we'll build a little bit of community that way. I know that we've got in the chat box the video from Ashley on the resizing block that Colleen just mentioned. So that's where you'll want to go to look for that. There's also another link that's dropped into there. Sue was asking about information on the Quilt of Valor program. So Colleen, it'd be great if you could talk a little bit about that. And in the chat box is a link to the Valiant Stars quilt pattern that's on Craftsy. So that's your link. I'm going to let Colleen take over and talk a little bit about it.
Okay. So the Valiant Stars was a challenge quilt that we made a few months back. I still have quilters who are working on it, and I love following your progress. Just because we started it, a few weeks ago doesn't mean that you can't jump in and download that pattern and have some fun with it. It is what I would call Quilt of Valor friendly pattern. It will fit the parameters of what a Quilt of Valor size approximately is. They request a certain size so that there is some continuity within quilts that are given in as a presentation quilt to a veteran. There are, let me think, I have to think about it. 1, 2, 3 blocks within it, I think, if I remember right. There's a row in the center of card trick blocks, and then there were Ohio Stars, and then Doris's Delight was the last of the blocks. So we worked as a row quilt, horizontal rows across, and then matching rows out from the center, and then 2 more after that. We started with some really easy 4 patches as corner stones for the outside edge of the quilt. And then we really ramped up and learned some skills. We did a lot of different techniques. We did jump into some tools, and some people were asking about, why this tool, but there are templates. So if you are not a tool person and you don't have access to tools, the templates are available also in the download under the tabs for all of the Valiant Stars, the patterns, and all of the videos all live together. So you can go back and create your own challenge, even bring together a group of friends and do a challenge just between your small group. Now, some people did not go into the red, white, and blue kind of colorway. They decided that they wanted to do something bright and springy, or they wanted to do something for a family member or a husband, and they went in other colorways. So there are some really great photos of quilts in the gallery. So go in the gallery and see the different versions of Valiant Stars that were created. You will find that there are sometimes people were like, why are we doing this technique? Why are we doing that? And later they were like, oh, look at how much fun this is. So sometimes when we are presented with something new, a challenge that maybe we haven't done before, we kind of wonder, why am I doing this? And then later they're like, oh, but now I have the skill to do this shape. And that leads to how many more blocks and how many more projects for you to create in your quilt journey. So Valiant Stars was a kind of a skill builder project along the way. Everybody was sharing information, different techniques, different approaches. So you'll find all kinds of really good support stuff in the videos, and the patterns are all there free for you to download. So the Quilt of Valor program was started quite a few years ago by some ladies that decided that we have veterans who hadn't been honored enough. There were times when soldiers came back from conflict and weren't viewed in a very positive light. I know some personally that weren't very honored when they returned home. So that's what actually spurred me to make the quilt that I created, Valiant Stars. And he will receive it soon. He doesn't watch Facebook. He's not on Facebook. So as soon as his granddaughters arrive in Iowa this summer, he will be getting his award of his Valiant Stars quilt for his 3 tours during Vietnam. It's one way that we can give back. As quilters, we're always looking for people to provide a quilt for, to say thank you, to say I honor what you did, or a mark in time, an anniversary, some kind of thing that we're always creating quilts that have some kind of meaning, that mark history, say thank you or I love you. And the Quilts of Valor program was started just for that purpose. It kept us as quilters busy. It gave those who served our country and gave a lot of their time and effort and time away from family, and sometimes even through injury, that recognition that what they did, what they sacrificed, was really important, and that we value that and we value our freedoms. So Quilts of Valor was, I think, a very honorable, very worthwhile project. And that's what kind of spurred me to then create Valiant Stars, which is very compatible with the Quilt of Valor program. So if you're looking for a different pattern, if you're looking for something, a skill builder, maybe there's just 1 or 2 blocks out of there that you would like to use in something or play with, or just test out. The patterns are free, so go in and download the pattern that really speaks to you and try out something new.
There's a follow-on here. You mentioned that it falls within the requirements, and Sue is curious. She's heard there are a lot of requirements to meet. Can you speak a little bit about what makes a quilt of valor a quilt of valor? What are those requirements?
There are a few guidelines, and I don't have them in front of me at this moment, but you can find them by just putting in Quilt of Valor size requirements, and that'll take you to their homepage, and it'll tell you about the things that they're asking for. When they started the program, they thought, well, we could just have people make quilts for veterans or people who served, right? Well, the thing is that kind of opens a whole can of worms. And quilts can be so many different sizes and so many different kinds of themes that they tried to at least put some parameters out there. So they want them to be big enough. I think it's somewhere around 65 by 70 something, big enough that can be wrapped around a veteran. So when a Quilt of Valor ceremony takes place, they usually wrap the quilt around the veteran or around them if they're seated, if they can't stand, wrap it around them. And the idea is that it's like a big hug. So they want them to be at least a size that can be wrapped around a body for the presentation, or as in the awards portion of the ceremony that goes with the Quilt of Valor. They do usually suggest, they don't require that it be red, white, and blue. It's just suggested that it be patriotic themed. Star patterns are wonderful. You can use panels in portions of it. I know my mother-in-law has done several, and my sister-in-laws have done several of the Quilt of Valor projects and awards, and they've used some of the eagle panels that are available out there, some of the ones that have flags and different kinds of themes to them. And sometimes we say, oh, well, a panel like that, what would I do with it? Well, you can build out that as a center or put it off center and build out with stars and stripes and blocks that fit and nest together with that and make a wonderful presentation for a veteran. So size is something that they're going to give you a range for and suggestion on a theme to it. Red, white, and blue is kind of nice. If anyone who's served in the military, that's close to their heart. It will also, if you go to the Quilts of Valor site, they also have some patterns available for you to use, or at least to peruse through to see, get you inspired maybe, oh, I want to make something like that. So you can go ahead and go that direction. If you want it to be an official Quilt of Valor, they do ask that you register it on the site, and that doesn't cost anything. It's just you're entering the information. You do need to gather a little bit of information about the person you're awarding it to, I believe. There are groups out there, if you don't have someone you would like to make a quilt, but don't have someone that you know personally that you want to make that quilt for, there are groups out there, and I believe they may have those listed so that you could even just donate a quilt to a group that's going to present them to veterans. But in a lot of towns around, if you contact quilt guilds that are local, close to you, or even check at your local quilt shop, you will get connected with somebody who does presentation quilts for Quilts of Valor. So those are the main things. And usually they want those quilts to be labeled with the veteran's name when they served. And then I believe they include your name and where you lived and just some of the basic kinds of things like that.
Okay, and as a reminder, there's a link in the chat box if you're curious about that Quilt of Valor program, specifically the Valiant Stars quilt pattern that's on Craftsy. That link is in the chat box. That was awesome to talk about. Thank you for taking a brief detour and giving us details on that, Colleen. Much appreciated. Very well said Linda. So we can go into our next question here. This is a very technical one. So we're going from broad kind of emotional connection to quilting to very specific. And this is all about a bobbin. So Sue wants to know, when I'm machine quilting on my domestic, I've noticed that my bobbin stitches are shorter than my top stitches. So what would cause this? And also, do you have any suggestions for a fix?
Okay, there are a few things to address. Double check, when was the last time that you cleaned in the bobbin area? So take off the bobbin cover, take out the bobbin, pop that apart. And depending on your machine, everyone is a little bit different. But if you can take out the race, the part that actually holds your bobbin, you may need to clean underneath there so that the thread can more easily be pulled And I can't even pull mine out right now. Usually I can pop it right out with one finger. But sometimes there's a buildup of lint underneath of the race. So make sure that that's a clean area. Another thing would be to put in a new needle in your machine. Make sure that the needle is nice and sharp. I'm as guilty as everyone else. I don't replace my sewing machine needle as often as I really ought to, because the integrity of the stitch is really defined by how that needle goes down through the fabric and interacts with the bobbin thread at the bottom. So clean under the bobbin, make sure that this whole area is nice and clean, put a Q-tip in there, pull all the fuzzies and the little bunnies that are living inside there. We would rather the bunnies be in our backyard than in our sewing machine. Put in a new needle and make sure that when you put your needle in, you get it in the right direction. The little groove on the needle should go to the front. The other thing is to check to see what size needle you're using. Most of the time, I think I'm machine quilting either a 12 or a 14, depending on how thick your batting is. Also check to see what weight of thread you're using, because if the bobbin thread is a different weight than your top thread, sometimes on domestic machines, that can be a little bit of an issue. And the machine really likes the weight of the thread to be the same. Our machines anymore are very sensitive to tension, and they really like that the thickness of that thread to be the same, that the size of the thread to be the same top and bottom. I know there are times when I have used bobbin weight thread when I'm piecing. The nice part about it, it's very fine. I can put a lot more on a bobbin than a regular thread, and I don't have to wind my bobbin as often. But when I'm going to go do the machine quilting, then making sure that those threads both are the same weight of thread. And the other thing I think to think of and maybe be aware of is the speed at which you stitch. Consistent speed. I know when I was first beginning to do machine quilting on my domestic machine, I like to meander. It was easy for my brain to wrap around that kind of puzzle piecing, looping back and forth. But when I was working on that, I would notice that I would get what's called eyelashing. And when I would get to a curve and come back, I went faster on the curve before I returned to shape. And then every time I would loop out, I went faster. And then I got a pulling underneath, and my stitches were smaller. And I could see the top thread pulling down to the back. And they call that eyelashing, because if you see those little lines going together, it's kind of like your eyelashes appearing on the back of your quilt. So a smooth, accurate speed as you machine quilt. For some people, it's also practice with that evenness comes with the control of the foot pedal. And so if you tend to start slow and then get faster and faster and faster, if you have speed control on your machine. On mine, I have a slide that has like 3 different positions of speed. Now, the slow one is really slow. I can't go at snail pace. But if that rabbit speed is a little bit too much, back it up just a little, and maybe that medium speed will help you coordinate your foot, feet, and your hands, because that's where you're the one controlling the stitching, at least in free motion quilting. I think that most of the time when we have issues with stitch length, it's mostly in that free motion, because we're controlling the stitching as we stitch. So really try to practice coordinating that speed of the machine with the speed that you use with the power on your foot pedal. So it does take some time. A lot of us, when we get into quilting, our piecing goes from kindergarten to graduate work like that. It's just, we can get those skills down. But our sewing machine, or the actual quilting process, tends to lag a little bit. And we do need to practice that. Even if you always keep a practice scrap layer sandwich nearby, so you can kind of loosen up your shoulders before you jump into your project, it will help and get your quilting to be more even. A friend of mine used to say, after 30 minutes, you can tell from where I started to where I am. So in 30 minutes, I get better. So maybe try to get that first 10 minutes out of the way on a scrap and then jump into your project.
All right, all good tips. Hopefully those are some helpful things to keep in mind. We've got Elva here with another problem to see if you can troubleshoot for us, Colleen. So Elva said, I messed up and I broke my first machine needle last night. Elva wants to know, should I just remove and replace it, or might alignment be an issue so that it would be needing to be checked by a mechanic? She notes that she should have changed out the foot for a change in stitch, but she did not. So what do you suggest for Elva here?
Guilty as charged. Have done it many times. I'm just glad you didn't get injured, because sometimes when that needle snaps, it can fly. It can break into more than one piece. One thing to double check is try to find all of the pieces to the needle, because sometimes I've had them fracture and cut and break into like 3 pieces. The eye was still attached to the thread. The post part is still in the machine, but the middle was missing. And that was scary because I didn't want to stepping on it, but I didn't want it to be down inside my machine. So going in and kind of double check. This is another time to clean up under our machine, look for it down there, see if a lot of times it usually snaps away from the machine because of the force coming down. It tends to pop out and away. So also take a magnet, check the floor where you were sitting. Don't step on it, because emergency rooms are worse than taking your sewing machine to the serviceman. So find the pieces of the needle, number one, if you can. Usually our machines, the needles are made so they will snap before they damage our timing on our machines. Now, that being said, on a long arm machine, it has a lot more force and pounds of pressure coming down on those needles, and they can be knocked out of time just because of the pure horsepower that's in those machines. And I'm pointing that direction because mine's in that room. So a lot of time I have never knocked my machine out of time. And I have gone through, well, I've been sewing since I was 8. So more than likely you have not knocked it out of timing. Take out the needle, actually find your sewing machine manual, or if the manual's online, a lot of them anymore are, you can access it there. If you happen to have put it away someplace so well from yourself you can't find it, a lot of the manuals are online. You'll be able to find, changing out the sewing machine needle there. It's just so you have reference when you're doing it. The other thing to do when you go to take out the portion that's still stuck in the machine is that we don't want to have that drop into the machine. So take something, a piece of fabric, a piece of paper, something, cover the base of your sewing machine, because as you loosen it, it may drop out before you can grab a hold of it very well. And that way it won't drop into your sewing machine. Always safety first, so you can make sure that if it drops out, it's not going to be inside your machine. Then you can go ahead and replace and put in a new needle. Try to figure out a way to make notations. Some people put a Post-it note on the side of their machine, change needle on, and then the date. Others will actually put a little sticky tag on the package of needles so they know, okay, I put in a 9014 needle on this date. And then they put that sticky tag on the outside of the package so that they know that's the kind of needle I put in on this date. And then that lives in a cabinet someplace. So trying to kind of remember when you changed it is always a good thing. More than likely, the needle may have just been worn. Yes, you may have had the wrong foot on. That happens. But it also may have started to wear a bit and had a weak spot in it. So that's why usually they snap before they break or damage the timing on our machines. Just remember that as you, unless I think there's only maybe one brand of machine out there that's a little different, and now I can't remember which brand it is, but most machines, the needle has a flat portion on the top shaft of the needle. That flat portion goes to the back side, and the groove in the needle goes down the front. You can feel it with your fingernail, or with a pin, you can find that groove. That should be pointing toward you. That's the portion that the thread itself actually rides down in that groove, goes through the eye of the needle while the machine is working. So always remember that groove to the front, and then make sure that you actually insert it all the way up into the machine. and then tighten well. Usually you've got a screwdriver that fits that little fitting on your machine, so that you make sure that you do tighten that. Don't just tighten by hand. Take the tool that's made for your machine and tighten it just a bit, because if you do it by hand, the needle will fall out. And why do I know this? I've done it. I've probably done everything that you could possibly mess up on machines. So make sure that you tighten it properly, and then you will be off and sewing again.
All right. I love that. Sometimes, in order to give the best advice, you also have to make all the mistakes. That's fine. All right. Ratha's got our next question, and this is a good one. I can't wait to see what you do with this one, Colleen. Ratha wants to know what your trick is to a perfect 1/4 inch seam.
Perfect 1/4 inch seam. Okay. There are a few different ways you can approach it. When I first started sewing, I thought I knew what a 1/4 inch seam looks like, because I'd done garment sewing for years and I knew what a seam allowance looked like. Well, I knew what a 5/8 inch seam allowance looked like, and 1/4 inch was a whole nother game. My first instructor, this was a trick that she used for all of us. And I still, when I teach beginners, this is what I do. Go get a recipe card from your kitchen. One of those index cards that has the stripes on it. Those blue lines are exactly a 1/4 inch apart. And look, I even keep some on hand, because, there's times that I'm teaching that I have to have supplies. Okay, so that card then is used. Put it under your machine. Use the hand wheel on your machine, that round piece on the end, and drop the needle down right into one of the blue lines. Pierce it perfectly, and then put your presser foot down. And I don't even have my machine on. Put the presser foot down, and then look to see where the next blue line to the right of the needle falls. Now, my machine does have a setting for, let me see here, my 1/4, it has one that says it's a 1/4 inch. And, whoops, now when I put my presser foot down, it will give me a 1/4 inch from the edge of my presser foot. Now, on some machines, the needle to the edge of the presser foot, a standard presser foot, is close. Sometimes the blue line is just under the presser foot. Now, if you have a machine where you can adjust the needle position left to right, fine adjustment, then you can move it over just enough so that the blue line rides on the outside edge of your presser foot. That's one approach. There are 2 or 3 more. Let's see if I can actually come up with the foot out of my stash of sewing feet. I don't know if it's in here. Let's see. Sewing machines come with so many presser feet that it's kind of a challenge sometimes. Okay, here's one. And there is another one available, but I don't happen to have it handy. Okay, there is, oh, that's not the one. This one. Oh, I do have both of them here. Okay. There is one that has a little blade. Let me see if I can hold this up to the camera a little bit. This one has a little blade on the side of it. And I call this like bumper bowling. That little blade on the side allows you to put your sewing or your seam allowance up against that blade and have a 1/4 inch seam. But if you push the fabric in there too far, you'll jam up against it and you'll get extra wide 1/4 inch. I call it healthy 1/4 inch seam allowance. It just needs to ride near it, but not jammed up the wall. Okay, so it needs to stay flat on the sewing bed surface, and it just needs to kiss that edge of that blade, and you'll have a 1/4 inch seam. Now, there's also a presser foot that's called a 1/4 inch foot, and it's very narrow on the tip. Let me hold it up here. My finger in the way. It's a narrower tip so that at the 1/4 inch seam setting, that the edge of this presser foot is a 1/4 inch. Now, everyone has different preferences on which of the feet they like to use. It also depends on if you're a person that is doing other kinds of stitches and other kinds of sewing. Get this out of the way here quick. There are times when that little blade on the one with the bumper edge for 1/4 inch, this is good. This is kind of your beginner. This is kind of like bumper bowling till you learn how, your training wheels. Because there are times when this blade gets in the way and it drags on the fabric when you're doing, say, applying binding, or if you're doing 8 at a time triangle squares and you're sewing across the fabric and you don't have any cut edge anywhere near the presser foot, you're sewing through the middle of a piece of fabric. Sometimes there's a drag that happens on this blade on the edge. So this is good when you're just learning to piece, getting down, just maybe joining squares together, just learning your piecing. But there are times when people enjoy using this a lot. It's kind of a security blanket of knowing where that 1/4 inch is. Other people like what they call the 1/4 inch foot without the blade on it. They like the fact that it has a single hole needle position here. It doesn't have that big wide open oval, so that there isn't any pull up away from the needle when you're stitching. So it's got a single needle position. So the needle has to be in the center position for this to work. This would cause a needle break if you're like me and you switch back and forth from maybe doing a zigzag stitch to a decorative stitch to a straight stitch. You have to remember to take this foot off and go back to that zigzag foot, that one with the open, that oval open area for the needle to go down into. Because I don't like changing feet very often, that's why I have figured out exactly from my needle to the edge of my foot where my 1/4 inch falls, so I don't have to change feet as often. But it's kind of a personal choice. Other people find that the bumper edge with the blade on the edge is their favorite. Others find the 1/4 inch foot that without the bumper, their favorite go-to sewing machine foot for 1/4 inch seaming. So that being said, I give you 3 choices, 3 ways to do it. There are older machines out there that sometimes these feet aren't available for. That's why I give you the default method, because on my old sewing machine, I started piecing on an old Kenmore machine that was given to me as a graduation present from high school. Look at how much gray hair I have. I have 4 kids. I have 6 grandkids. That machine is ancient, but it was what I had. So when I started, I was using the method of using the stripes on that recipe card to figure out where my 1/4 inch was, and even just putting a piece of painter's tape on my machine, or even a stack of Post-it notes to create your own bumper. So a 1/4 inch seam is going to be really vital to success in piecing, because all of the math, all of the engineering centers around those accurate 1/4 inch seams. So practice makes perfect.
Joan says, brilliant explanations. So thank you for all of those tips. Hopefully everybody watching is also going to have that perfect 1/4 inch seam before they know it. I will jump in before we get to the next question and say we have about 15 minutes left of time with Colleen. We have a couple questions hanging out to be asked. If you're hanging on to one, this is your chance to get it in, to try and get it asked and answered today. If it doesn't get asked today, come back. We always do these about once a month, so there will be another opportunity for you to get some questions in for Colleen. But this is probably the time to drop them into the chat box for today's. All right, let's go to Teresa next. Teresa is looking for, really wanting to learn how to prevent wavy edges. And I know Teresa is not alone in this. Colleen, what do you have to say about those waves?
Waves are pretty if they're on the beach in Hawaii, like one of our viewers from Hawaii, or on a lake. But they are not the prettiest things when we find them on quilts. There is, and I'm going to send our moderator to find. I've done a couple of different times. I've done things about adding borders. There was a live event through Facebook that was adding borders and how to properly measure and figure out borders for quilts. So that can be a resource. The biggest thing I think for most of us is that we are so thrilled by getting the center patchwork of our quilt done. And all we have left is borders that we race through the border process. And that's what usually creates the wavy borders. I've even had clients bring me their quilt center and finally gave up and brought me the fabric for the borders and said, please, because they have had issues with wavy borders over and over and over again. So wavy borders are prevented by measuring along the outer edge of both sides of your quilt top, so both sides, and then, I hate to say it, but measure down through the center of your quilt. Those three numbers may not be exactly the same. And the idea is that we're going to try and find an average. So we're going to take three numbers, one from each side and down through the center of our quilt. We're going to add those three numbers together. So measurement from the left side, the center, and the right side, add those numbers together, divide by 3. That gives us an average. I know math is making us all cringe right now, but it's easy math. That's the average, okay? So that means that's what we need to cut the borders for the top and bottom of our quilt. The pieces are going to fit along here because the side that we're measuring. What am I thinking? The sides that we're going to be putting it onto. We want to kind of force our quilt into square. Hopefully those numbers are only off by maybe 3/8, a quarter inch, maybe half an inch. Let's hope it's not more than that, but that's the average. So we want to cut the 2 borders for the sides of our quilt that length. Now, if you are nervous about doing that, get the width of the border, put a fabric mark where I told you to put it, the average, and add a little bit just for insurance purposes, and then cut your border. But make them both the same for both sides. But put that little mark in there, the average that I'm telling you to use, okay? Then when you go to apply it to your quilt, a lot of us, this is where the race comes in. We lay that fabric, I'm going to use my recipe card as a piece of fabric. We get in a hurry. We take that fabric border, we lay it on the quilt, and we race down the side, and we say, one on, go to the other side, race down that side. Second border's on. We lop off whatever it was at the bottom. We don't measure. We just lop it off. And that's where they get to be different sizes and we have issues. So you've cut that border, the average length that you need, right? That number, line it up here, take that mark that I told you to put on the border and put it at the bottom of that side. Then pin. I'm not a pinning person, but here's where you need to pin. You need to be able to pin that border onto the edge of the quilt so that it fits properly. Not just keep pulling and tugging on it as you add it, or force more fabric than you need into that edge so that it is a standard length now. Go and do the same thing on the other one. You need to apply it by pinning the beginning, the end. If it's a really long border, you can find the center, match that up, even go into quarters, dividing it up there and pinning, but everything should be, both sides should be the same size. When you have those on, then you go back and go the other direction of your quilt. Refold. You'll have borders on sides here. Now you need to measure one side down through the middle. You see a pattern happening there. And then the other, the far side. So you're always measuring in 3 places, along the outer edge, and then the part that really keeps you honest, down through the middle. So add those numbers again together, divide by 3. That will be the length of the border you need for the last 2 sides of your quilt. Again, make sure you take that border strip. Don't just lay it on there and start sewing. Lay it on there and actually pin it in place so that it is properly centered on there and both sides will be the same size. What tends to happen in that whole race to put it on is either we're pushing fabric into the machine or we're tugging on something. And a lot of times it's the bottom the quilt itself, the quilt patchwork part, is usually on the bottom. It's usually riding down here, and we have our border on top because it's smaller, and we're putting in the machine. But the patchwork part is hanging down off the sewing machine and onto our laps, and we're kind of tugging on to get it straight as we put it in the machine, and we're stretching it. And then we're stretching the top, and we don't have it aligned right. And that's when we get this two loopy edges, then, which creates some issues when it comes to quilting them. Because when we lay things on a tabletop and they aren't flat, there's fullness, and then we don't know where to put the fullness. So try to do that measurement on each side of the quilt, down through the middle, and get those borders on there pinned in place before you stitch them on, so that you properly square it up and get a nice flat border for your quilt.
Right, fantastic. Now, before we get to our last two questions, a quick reminder from me. First, there is a link available to Colleen, again, what you shouted out, the Facebook video for finishing quilts. So we're talking about borders. If you're curious about a little more detail and you want to see it in real time, go ahead and click on that link. That is in the chat box for you, as well as check out the link to the free download for the Sapphire Shimmer pattern. We had a question, what is it that you are using to demonstrate with? It is that quilt pattern right there. And you can click the link in the description for that, so you can grab that for yourself and have a little fun with that pattern. Now we've got two questions left. Like I said, we're going to go to Lucy's next. Lucy always wants to avoid labeling quilts, but knows that she should. Do you have any tips on the quickest, easiest label?
Quickest, easiest label. They all take a little bit of time. I think the biggest thing for us to realize is that quilts are a work of art, and artists sign their quilts. So no matter how much time it takes, it's one of those steps that we need to do to say, I made that. Because there are the people that either end up with our quilts, or they're gifted to, or receive them, or maybe years from now find this quilt. There's something to be said for knowing who the artist is. You go to an art gallery and you look for the signature hidden in the artwork. We put ours on the back even as quilters. So we're not being too prideful. We're not putting our signature on the front. We're hiding it on the back. But there are many ways to approach putting a label. I'll grab a piece of fabric here. I tend to be a person who just uses a piece of either white or a very natural color fabric. I usually use a rectangle. I put some freezer paper on the back that has the kind of waxy side so I can write on the fabric itself. I will usually give a name to my quilt, and then the date or month, or at least the year that I made the quilt. Some quilts take a little bit longer to make. Then sign your name, and also where you lived at the time, because quilts tend to travel. They get around, and there are stories of quilts that have kind of lost their history because nobody knows where they came from or when they were made. So I tend to, let's see if I can flip over this one. The label, like on the back of this one, I frame that piece of fabric then, the center, with some of the fabric from the quilt itself, just to give it some definition against whatever the backing fabric is on my quilt. I use a pigment pen that is going to be permanent, which means you sometimes have to write a label more than once because misspellings happen and pens slip. But on this one, I labeled it because this is the quilt called A Place to Bloom. It was the row by row that Craftsy Virtual Quilt Retreat, who it was hosted by with Kelly Ashton and myself in March of 2021. Because over time, I would forget when I made a quilt, or if it's gifted to someone. I taught my nieces and nephews the first thing to do when they opened a quilt was to look on the back and find their name. And my one niece, who now is in college, I remember hearing that she flipped over the quilt and said, me name on the back. She might have been 3 at the time. The pride that we take in our work needs to show. And so we need to claim it as our artwork. Give credit to a designer if you used a designer's pattern. and any little pertinent information about where you lived and the month and the year that you created the quilt. Stitch that onto the back. Now, there are other ways to make quilt labels. I tend to make rectangular ones like that. Some people will take a square of fabric, fold it in half to make a triangle like this. And then before they put the binding on, they will put that triangle of fabric into the corner. And you can write on this before you actually stitch it into the quilt. But remember that you're going to have seam allowances on the two raw edges there. And then when you put your binding on, the binding then covers the raw edges. And all you have to hand stitch down is the fold line here so that the message and your writing go diagonally across the corner there. That's another way to label your quilt. There are pre-made labels out there that it'll say quilt name, made by, date, and you just fill in the blanks. You can machine embroider a quilt label. You can hand embroider a quilt label. There are as many ways to label a quilt as there are quilts to make, I think. Pick one way or method that you enjoy, but take pride in your work. If nothing else, at least get your name on there. Sometimes people will hide their name in the backing fabric by just writing directly on the quilt itself. So pick a method that you enjoy and take pride in your work.
All right, it's time for our final question of today's Q&A. This one comes in from Patricia, and Patricia wants to know, Colleen, what is the best method for pressing seams?
Pressing seams, one of the really vital steps that we need to make sure we don't avoid. Some of us like to sit at the sewing machine and sew and sew and sew and think, I'll just kind of finger press this and then I'll go on to the next step, when we actually should get up from the machine and move to the iron. Whenever you're joining two seams or two fabrics together and creating a seam, you should always take that to the ironing board, press the seam flat first, which means that if I were to join two pieces, I always have fabric available. How does that happen? I don't know. Whenever you join two pieces of fabric together and create a seam, the stitching down through that kind of ruffles up the fabric. And what we need to do is set the fabric first, set the seam. So take that fabric with the seam, take it to the ironing board and press flat. It warms up the fibers. It makes the bending of the fiber to open up the seam allowance a little easier and a little nicer, a little crisper in the end. And then open up the seam, press usually the seam allowance to one side, usually the darker of the two fabrics. And the reason why we do that is pressing the seam allowance to one side under the dark fabric is we don't get a shadow line of where the seam allowance is then under the light color fabric. Now, there are times when we press in different directions. There are times when a designer may request that you press seam allowances open. Usually those are always done because of another portion is going to be stitched to it, and maybe it causes an opposing seam then. So if there are directions for direction, or the direct, how should I say it? The angle, the position that you should push the seam allowances, follow what instructions give you. If they aren't given, always press seam allowances to the darker fabric. There are times when pressing that seam allowance open does reduce the bulk. Sometimes there are times when 5 or 6 seams or 8 seams are coming together, and you're going to have all kinds of thickness in the center, maybe of a star block. Say intersections like here, when there are 5 seams coming together. Pressing seam allowances open in that case can reduce the bulk as you approach that intersection point. So there are times to press seam allowances open. Look to see what a designer has suggested within a pattern. Sometimes it's just the simple little arrow in a diagram that tells you press seam allowances to one side. If not, just press them toward the darker fabric. But remember to get up from the sewing machine, go to the ironing station, move back and forth. It's very good for circulation also. We sit too long, so don't forget to press, to actually get into that good habit of moving from sewing to pressing, because trying to do it later with the nose of the iron when there's a lot of seams that have to be figured out can be more confusing. So just remember to take it step by step, press as you go.
All right. Well, with that, we have reached the end of our hour here with Colleen. So it's time to sign off, but just for today, before we go, Colleen, what should people be looking out for in the future? I know you gave us a little quick tease, but what do we have coming up from you?
We have all kinds of things coming up. I designed a Christmas quilt yesterday. I've got a patriotic themed quilt coming. We're going to be talking about pushing ourselves outside our comfort zone on color choices at some point. This fun little trivet, Amish folded star is going to be coming up. So make sure you always check Facebook Live and National Quilt Circle and Craftsy and find out what we have in store next.
Oh, well, I know that some of our viewers have already commented that they can't wait for some of those things. So we're going to wait with bated breath to see them as they come out and we get a chance to spend a little more time with you. So Colleen, thank you for answering all of the questions today. Like I said, she'll be back again to answer more questions. So if you come up with something in the meantime, come on back and ask your questions then. Until then, my name is Leah on behalf of Colleen and our entire team at the National Quilter Circle. Thank you so much for joining us today. We will see you next time. And until then, happy quilting.